Hello, and welcome to episode 00025 of the 10,000 Heroes podcast. We are a quarter of the way to 100, which is 100th of the way to 10,000. So you do the math, but I think we're pretty far along. I'm Ankur Shah Delight, and today's interview is with Charlie Bresler. He earned a PhD in social and clinical psychology from Clark University. He became the director of behavioral medicine at the California School of Professional Psychology. He was a full-time professor for a while. And then he was recruited to the Men's Wearhouse, where he became the head of human resources and ultimately president. These days, he stepped down from that work a few years ago to work directly on social and economic issues. And in 2013, he became the volunteer executive director of The Life You Can Save, which is an effective altruism nonprofit based on the work of Peter Singer. And that's something I'll get into with him more in the podcast and something we'll focus on a lot. But thank you so much for joining us on this journey with Charlie. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned after the podcast for a debrief with my co-host, Nathan Ramos. And please get in touch via email at info@10kh.show. Okay, Charlie Bresler. Recently, I think you've been best known for your work with The Life You Can Save and the effective altruism movement, but which is in itself perhaps a funny thing since you haven't been doing that long, but that may end up being what you're known for in the future. But you've also been a tennis pro, a professor of psychology, and an executive in retail clothing. What's the through line? Do you see any kind of connection between those things, or is that just happenstance?
I don't see a clear through line. I don't see clear continuity, except that I think there has been a consistent dialogue within my mind about how I see the world and how I see my place in the world. And so I think that the consistency is in my head, but not in my behavior, if that makes any sense.
What's maybe an early example in your life? We can start going into little pictures or glimpses of your life of that.
Well, the earliest example that's completely consistent with how I view the world now probably comes my sophomore year in college. I had been in St. Louis and quite isolated during my freshman year in college at Washington University. Didn't do very much and didn't think a lot about what was going on in the world. In the spring of that year, which was, just to place it in time, was 1968, a long time ago, my dad would call me and tell me about what was going on at Columbia with the student quote unquote uprisings. And I remember being pretty disinterested. I think I was just disinterested in most things. I wanted to get back east. I wanted to transfer. I wanted to be closer to Diana, who's now my wife. And I just wanted to get the hell out of St. Louis, really. And I was focused on just sort of surviving the year. And it was very unproductive. But when I got back to NYU, my sophomore year in college, I was immediately immersed in a civil rights controversy on campus. And everything that my dad had been talking to me about with the anti-war movement was really present. And so I developed what might be thought of in shorthand as a radical consciousness in terms of my view of American capitalism, American imperialism. And I started reading a lot and getting immersed in Noam Chomsky's work and others similar. During the same period of time, I read a lot of Orwell, looking back on the Spanish War, Homage to Catalonia, Politics in the English Language. I started reading the British social critic Raymond Williams, and now I'm conflating my sophomore year with my junior and senior year. I joined a group called the Radical History Caucus that was made up of a diverse group of graduate students, primarily from Marxist-Leninist Italian Gramsci followers to radical feminists. There weren't a lot of us. We were all quasi-intellectuals. We took part in demonstrations, but we weren't what you would say on the front lines. And so I developed a very different view of the world from that I grew up with. And it was a view of identifying myself as a democratic socialist or anarcho-syndicalist, which I can go into and to explain to other people who are listening who are not familiar with those terms. But my consciousness changed. And that is the consciousness in many ways that I've brought through all these various things, including my activities as a capitalist, if you will, in a public clothing company, and even as president. So what has gone in my head relative to my social view hasn't really changed at all, say, from my junior year in 1970 through the present 2022.
And you had mentioned that your father was kind of instrumental or pushing you somewhat in that direction. When you had this radical break in consciousness, did it bring you closer to your dad's perspective, or did you kind of go even further and it led to
I went
a
much
gulf?
further away from my dad. My father was in university between 1937 and 1941. And he was what I imagine he was just working all the time in the library. I mean, he went to Harvard. He was a very, very good student, but he was very obsessive and he was very slow throughout his entire life. And so although he was very smart, he couldn't really accomplish very much. So I think he just spent his whole time in Widener Library. But he was, if he was politically identified, I would describe him as a progressive anti-communist. And he wrote a book about Hugo Black, who turned out to be a very liberal member of the Supreme Court during the 50s and 60s. And so he had a liberal perspective, I would say, but he was progressive, at least in the context of American society. But when I became quote unquote radicalized, I hate that phrase, but that's the one that people use, I moved way left of my dad, and my social vision was very different than his. What I did have in common, by and large, was a real respect for his anti-communist leftists. Even though I hung out with a bunch of Marxist-Leninists, I realized the horrors of Stalin and Mao most of the time. Every once in a while, like a lot of the leftists, I would get romantic because I wanted to believe that there was something to hang on to. But for the most part, I moved beyond my dad. I shouldn't say beyond in the sense that it denigrates his point of view, but I moved what I believed then and I believe now is beyond his political consciousness. Mm-hmm. And he was scared that I was going to get kicked out of college and ruin my life.
And was that possible?
I didn't mind getting kicked out of college. I was fine with getting kicked out of college. It felt like it was my moral responsibility to speak up, which I did frequently, and challenge professors, etc. But I really wasn't about wanting to go to jail or get beat up by the police. So I think there was reason for him to be concerned, or when the draft came, that I would move to Canada illegally. But I don't think he needed to be concerned that I was going to end up in jail because I was too much of a coward for that to happen.
Okay, well, given that, how did you navigate the draft?
Well, in the end, I didn't have to go to Canada because I had the draft number of 298. So I wasn't selected. I wasn't selected for the draft. But I never considered the idea of going into fight in Vietnam or into the army. I always knew that if I would be drafted, I would go to Canada illegally. My mother, by the way, is Canadian, or was Canadian when she was alive, but she gave up her American citizenship at a time. You couldn't be citizens of both countries. So when she married my father at 19, she gave up her Canadian citizenship, which was really too bad for me. I mean, it's still too bad because I'd love to be a Canadian citizen. And frankly, if it weren't for my children and grandchildren, I would be living in Canada now. So,
right. Okay. So then, all right, I want to get to some of these like kind of unexpected juicy bits in the story. What was the link between, how did you get to be the tennis pro from all of this like radical ideology?
So I was really active from 1968 to 1975 when the war in Vietnam formally ended in 1975. I mean, it was all but over by 1973, but there really wasn't much left of the left, as they say, in 1975. And I was always sort of fringe on the left because there weren't a lot of people on the left who saw the world quite the way that I did or Diana did or the people that I hung out with did. And then in 1975, I quit. It's funny, somebody asked my son Noah when he was 22 what he would do differently from his parents' generation in terms of social change. He said, well, I wouldn't quit when I was 30. And I thought that was a wonderful comment because that was his perception when he wrote that 15 years ago, that Diana and I had pretty much quit any attempt to really change the world. And I think that was a fair comment. I think my work with The Life You Can Save is a bit different, but that came after Noah made that comment. So I do think I dropped out. And once I dropped out and I quit teaching high school and proselytizing these ideas, which I did for a few years from 73 through 76, I kind of I didn't become a fascist like Orwell claims a lot of radicals become after they stop being radical intellectuals, but I really didn't participate in anything that could be considered moving the world towards social change or opposition to the American government.
So you had this like break in consciousness while you were in college. You got radicalized, as it said, and you decided to spend time then educating others. So you went and taught in high schools. And then at some point you were just like, I don't want to do that anymore. Like what happened there?
There was no place for me to land to do anything. And as I used to say, I wasn't interested in stuffing envelopes. And I wasn't going to become a member of a fringe group like the Young Socialist Alliance, a bunch of Trotskyist wannabes. Plus, I didn't agree with Trotsky any more than I agreed with Stalin. So there really was no place that I could see to land. And I wasn't smart enough, like Noam Chomsky, to start writing books that would be very influential. So I gave up, I think, largely, and became self-absorbed. And I retreated towards something that was really enjoyable to me, which was tennis. But I didn't change what was going on in my mind. That's what I meant by the thread.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not like you had an ideological shift. And it's not like you were dejected by like, oh, we're trying to get the government to change and it's not working and it's just too hard. It was more like you lacked a sense of community, or you just didn't have the right, it wasn't fun anymore, or you didn't have the right people with you along the way.
It was, I don't know about fun, but it wasn't productive. I think that was the word. It didn't feel like I was doing anything productive. And I couldn't stay teaching high school because I felt like high schools had two missions in our context at that time. One was to teach people who's smart and who's not smart, and who's cool and who's not cool. And I didn't really particularly care for my colleagues, and I was quite alienated. And so I didn't feel like I changed my analysis, but I became more self-indulgent, less feeling obligated to do anything, I guess morally licensed, or whatever word you want to use.
Because your attempts to do something weren't productive.
Right. I mean, I didn't expect that I would be changing the world, but I didn't find myself participating with people who did. Most of the activity was being done by liberals that I just didn't really want to participate. And I didn't find a place for myself. And I was hedonistic enough to want to do something that felt good for me. Mm-hmm. And it didn't feel good.
Okay. And so did it work for you to play tennis? Did that satisfy that?
In terms of feeling good about my life? Yeah. I mean, given that I was still pretty alienated from the dominant culture, quite alienated, but I was married to someone who felt similarly and had a few friends. Yeah. I mean, I was able to function in the world of tennis quite well, in spite of the fact that I was really different. I wished I was a better tennis player, but yeah, no, I was fine. Alienated, but generally happy, I guess I would say. Mm-hmm. And I did that for a while. And then I didn't want to manage a tennis club anymore. I still wanted to play tennis tournaments and have fun. So I asked someone at the tennis club if they could get me a job at the community mental health center, because he knew he was the assistant director of the mental health center. I said, I think I'm pretty good with people, so maybe I'd be good at counseling. And he got me a job. And I worked in a day. So I went from the tennis club to the day treatment center. And then from there, I carried a pager doing assessments of people acutely psychotic in emergency rooms. And it allowed me to be paid $7 an hour just carrying this pager and going into the emergency room every once in a while. So I was able to play tennis and get paid at the same time. I know $7 doesn't sound like a lot of money, but at the time, given that I didn't have any strong material needs, it was quite a lot of money for me for doing nothing except occasionally getting interrupted in the middle of the night by some woman who would say, I never should have left LA. I never should have left LA. I can't sleep. And, my response in my own head was, well, God, I can't sleep now either. But anyway, I was able to do that and still do the things that I enjoyed. But I liked being in community mental health more than I liked being at the tennis club by that time. Mm-hmm. And then when Diana got accepted to medical school, I decided, wait a second, I don't have a strong enough ego to hang out with a bunch of arrogant medical students and doctors and be a lousy tennis pro / psych tech. So I decided to go to graduate school in psychology and get a PhD. And so that was the driving force was I can't be a psych tech I better do something else.
Wow. I mean, so there's this narrative.
And I was right, by the way. I didn't have a strong enough ego to hang out around a bunch of arrogant doctors.
Yeah. That's just interesting, the role of your awareness of the needs of your ego in kind of all of these different decisions.
Yeah. I don't think of it that way, but I think that's a reasonable description.
Yeah. Okay. So then through this kind of on the face of it, a strange motivation, you end up with a PhD in psychology.
Well, I don't just end up with a PhD in psychology. I do think if we're going to follow this narrative, I had 3 fabulous years in graduate school. I developed this super close relationship with my dissertation director. I learned a lot about psychology, particularly attribution theory. I was able to integrate my background in Marxism into his work, and we had lots of really stimulating conversations about it. I learned other things that were of real value, wrote a paper on Marx's view of human nature, or a Marxist view of human nature. I had lots of really good friends in graduate school, and I left graduate school, I think, not with a different social consciousness, but with a broadened educational background. Because everything else before that had been history, politics. And now all of a sudden I had a psychological framework in which I could put the stimuli going on in my life. And that was extraordinarily gratifying and helpful to me. So graduate school was great. And so then I had my PhD in social and clinical psychology. But it was, even if I went to graduate school for the wrong reasons, maybe, it was a really good move and a really fortunate move on my part, particularly given that Diana was working 100 hours a week as a resident and medical student. And it would have been quite lonely had I not been in graduate school. So it was great in lots of ways.
It seems like you really found a community there.
I did. And that's certainly a theme in all this, is looking for a community beyond my relationship with Diana.
Yeah. So then what happened next?
I took a job. I wanted to move to California, and Diana was kind of neutral about it. She didn't really care that much. She got a job as a family practice preceptor in a residency program in Fresno. And I got a job as director of behavioral medicine at the California School of Professional Psychology, which was a school that gave people a PhD and taught them to be quote unquote psychotherapists. Most of my graduate students were really mediocre students on their way to becoming mediocre therapists or worse. But the best thing that happened while I was there for 7 years, in addition to, other than starting my family and having 2 children, the best thing that happened was I started running long distance, and that was great. And that continued for years and years and years. And I started a behavioral clinic for treating obsessive compulsive disorder and agoraphobia. And it was a really interesting project. And I think I did a really good job of learning that model and passing it on to some other people. And so those were the good things that happened while I was in graduate school. While I was teaching. It was 7 years that I was there. And then Diana and I decided we had to get the hell out of Fresno, that we didn't want to raise our family in the Central Valley of California. And since I had been lazy and not published a lot of stuff, it wasn't like I was in a position to get a job at Stanford. But we decided we wanted to move to the Bay Area. And so I said to Diana, if you get a job, I'll just figure something out. And I was about to start an anxiety clinic for a psychiatric hospital when somebody I knew from grade school and high school asked me if I would join his company and start a training program. And that was my foray into the capitalist world, because I said, yes, I will do that if you pay me $20,000 a year more than I would make for the anxiety clinic. So I was becoming quite mercenary. And he said, sure. And so I did. So Diana got a job in a family practice program north of the of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I got this job working at the Men's Wearhouse for George Zimmer. And that was my transition. And everyone in my family was pretty upset about my becoming a business person.
They weren't grateful that you had moved so far away from the Marxist-Leninist stuff?
Well, I'm talking about Diana more than
I
my
see.
mother. My mother liked to think of herself not only as a recovered mental patient and narcissist, but also as a progressive. So she thought that my going to work in business was sort of a sellout, although she'd lived off of other sellouts her entire life, including spending 8 years lying in bed in a mental institution that probably in current dollars cost like $400,000 a year. But she was beyond a fair amount of hypocrisy. If I sound a little bitter, it's probably because I am, although not nearly as bitter as Diana, because Diana has no tolerance for people who abandon their children like my mother did.
Well, I appreciate you being honest about whatever it is, including the bitterness.
I am. I try to be honest, except when it's more convenient to lie.
It's like you're playing a character of yourself. I love this.
Well, it's interesting. I was talking to Peter Singer. I was talking to people. We were having a big call at the Life You Can Save. And we were talking about whether or not we were being opportunistic in doing this, that, and the other thing at the Life You Can Save, meaning we were trying to get more people interested in our work. And were we bending the brand or breaking the brand in order to do that? And I said, I thought it would be really interesting to consider from a consequentialist perspective whether there is such a thing as opportunism, or it really is all about the consequences of your actions. And if it's opportunistic, but it has good consequences, it could be considered to be ethical. This is taking us beyond the scope of my little narrative here. Sorry.
But yeah, let's take this detour because it's something we're going to get back to. You work with the Life You Can Save. It's an organization that you helped start based on the work of Peter Singer, who's this famous utilitarian philosopher. And isn't the point, I mean, I'm probably oversimplifying it maybe intentionally here, but the point of the utilitarian perspective is that you have this goal and it kind of doesn't matter what you do along the way to get the goal, as long as you don't kind of contradict the goal you're reaching. Is that?
In a sense, as long as we define the goal as, creating happiness and avoiding discomfort for people and suffering. Yeah, I think that's true. I don't consider myself utilitarian, but I do think that that's a good approximation of utilitarianism. And it is true that the work we do is based upon Peter's point of view. And I'm okay with it. There's nothing that we do that I'm not comfortable with.
Yeah. So even that, like this question of breaking the brand or whatever it is of the Life You Can Save, if the point is to save lives and increase net happiness in the world, then it seems like the organization would want to do that.
Well, but pragmatically, if you break the brand, it's possible that it will undermine your long-term goal. Right. So it would be measured as not whether it's negative, opportunistic, and it would be measured in whether or not it's going to hurt you in the long run.
Yeah. Okay. So you got flack from a lot of sides for taking this job with George Zimmer at the Men's Wearhouse. What did you learn there that complemented all the things you had learned up to that point? Like, how did it round out your education as a human?
I learned how to create a culture that engages people to work in a project, which I'd never really done before. Maybe I'd done it in a haphazard way, but not in a self-conscious way. I learned how to analyze return on investment And I got better at thinking about numbers by far because I had to think about them all the time. I'd say those are the things that come to mind really quickly that I learned at the Men's Wearhouse that I was able to apply as I moved into the life you can save.
All right. I'd like to focus on the first one a little bit, analyzing numbers, ROI. I think that's well understood how to do that. The first thing that you said you learned, I think even today is not that well understood. And especially as we move towards organizations that are less hierarchical and we can use the kind of carrots and sticks of authority maybe less often, what you said could be even increasingly relevant. So how do you motivate people through culture rather than through authority?
I think it's really important for people to be brought into the decisions that affect their lives. And I think they have to be given the information and training that makes their participation in those decisions meaningful. And I think giving people or allowing people to have the experiences where they can learn what they need to know, how to do their job better, how to help other people do their job better, is foundational in building that culture. Because I don't think just giving people decision-making responsibility without them knowing what to do with it in some sense is a good thing to do. You don't give a 2-year-old the ability to make decisions, but it also sounds very paternalistic as I say it. I think you're having to give people really clarity about what you're trying to do, and you have to get them believing, and not get them believing, but you have to share a set of values or share a set of goals with those people and just be really human with people. A lot of people in business, as I'm sure you're aware, they're very manipulative. They don't share information openly. They are patronizing in how they relate to people they're working with. They're very hierarchical. All those things were important in building the kind of culture at the Men's Wearhouse that I wanted to be a part of, and that has been really important at the Life You Can Save in making people feel like we're really a group, in spite of the fact that we are apart, from Sydney, Australia, to Mumbai, India, to San Jose, Costa Rica, to San Francisco, California, to Cape Town, South Africa. I think that what I learned at the Men's Wearhouse in terms of helping people learn things and then become empowered to make decisions has been tremendously important at holding our organization together for the last 8 or 9 years.
Okay, that brings me to something that I've been thinking about the last couple of weeks. So let me bounce this off you. I have this notion that, many leaders in our world, let's say corporate leaders or government leaders, on the surface of it, they seem like total assholes. Is that a controversial statement for you to hear?
No.
Okay. And so I was thinking about this the other day and wondering, I'm an executive coach, like how I can support this and how I could help remedy that situation. And part of what occurred to me is that there are dynamics when you get into power that favor the emergence of these asshole tendencies. There's you're not having the same balance of stimuli that I might face in my normal life. Like there's if you're a rich and powerful leader or whatever it is, you have a disproportionate amount of people who are asking you for help, asking you for money, who are like coming to you with a sense of maybe need or entitlement or something. So you have sample bias, right, of what you experience, and many other factors like that lead to people kind of bringing out not necessarily the best of themselves in these conditions. This is my theory. Did you experience anything like that as you grew to a leadership role and eventually the president of this large public retail corporation?
Much less so, I think, than other people in similar positions. And I think that's the thread of my radicalization, even though I was behaving like a good capitalist and was worried about shareholder value, et cetera. I think I was constantly aware of being non-hierarchical, non-authoritarian, of being genuine in my interactions with people and admitting what I didn't know, even to the point of like them saying, how did this guy get his job? He doesn't seem to know anything. Whenever I ask him a question, he says, I don't know. What do you think? And so I think I was acutely aware of trying to fight against those tendencies. And it came naturally to me. And it made some people think I was strange, I think. I don't think I was perceived. Well, the word that people used to use to describe me was quirky. Like particularly in Houston, I was in San Francisco, but when I would go to the Houston office and just show up, and here I was at some point president of this organization, and I was like, carrying a backpack and like just seemed like the guy who just came in off the college campus or whatever. I just don't think I had that style, but I think it had a natural appeal to a lot of the right people at the Men's Wearhouse, and it allowed me to do my job really well, even though there were some people, I'm sure, that were just shaking their head. So I don't know if that answers your question, Ankur, or addresses what you were saying. But yeah, it was easy for me to not be that. I had other problems, I'm sure, but it was easy for me not to be the corporate executive.
Well, I mean, to be a different model of the corporate executive, and that's what we want, right? We want like the more positive model as a society of the corporate executive.
We started doing direct marketing for the first time, mostly direct mail at some point. And I was going to interview an organization in the Bay Area to see if they should be our direct mail organization. And they told me this story in retrospect, but everybody was nervous. Here I was, this was a big client potentially, and here the president was coming to talk to them, et cetera. And I showed up wearing blue jeans, a t-shirt, and carrying my backpack. And it was like it completely unnerved them, I think in a good way, but I ended up hiring them, by the way. And similarly, I went to Canada once. We were looking to hire people to buy the media for this company we had acquired in Canada. And I showed up in the same way. And I proceeded to interview these 13 women that were running this agency in a totally like, hey, let's have a drink kind of way. And I ended up hiring all 13 of them. So we ended up bringing media in-house, and they shut down they were part of a big media buying agency in the world. And they shut down their office and they just came to work for the Men's Wearhouse. And it was just kind of a disarming style that some people didn't like. I mean, I'm sure that some people didn't like it. But so how does this generalize to executive coaching?
That's kind of my question is like, you have your own style. That's great. Everyone has their own style. It's not like people can copy your style. But I just wonder, like, if there's something that you noticed that you could do as a kind of preventative measure for an executive to keep in their awareness so they don't end up in this pattern or this kind of trope of like the evil corporate executive.
Yeah, it was easier for me to work with people so that they didn't do that, so that they became different types of leaders, because I was able to model it every day, just naturally, not because, I'm going to go to work and model being a kind of non-hierarchical leader. It just was like, that's what I did. Whereas as an executive coach, you're not modeling it necessarily every day because you're the coach and they're trying to learn from you.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I'm more interested in, rather than like advice to me as the coach, is what are the kind of environmental hazards, or what are the pressures to watch out for someone in a leadership position?
I think you identified an important one when, people are coming to you looking for you to be the leader and to have all the answers. And the more that happens, the more you actually begin to think you're pretty important. And the other thing is you're going to see a lot of people who don't, I think of the first page of The Great Gatsby where Nick Carraway says, my mother always told me not everybody has the same advantages in life that I've had. And it's sort of like a lot of people, particularly in retail, have not had much education, don't have a lot of intellectual backing, may not be that smart in a purely academic way. They may be street smarter, they may not, but it's possible over time to get a very arrogant viewpoint towards coworkers who are constantly supplicants or treating you like the boss. And I think you have to consciously refuse to be the boss in that kind of way and be aware of your desire to be that cool, knowledgeable person that they want, that in some sense they want you to be. There's a famous, this would help, Ankur. There's a famous psychoanalyst named Harry Stack Sullivan, and he used to treat schizophrenic boys. And without getting too much into I'm not a psychoanalytically oriented person, but Freud believed, unlike Harry Stack Sullivan, that in psychotherapy, if you're pretty much a blank slate, eventually people will just project onto you certain characteristics that come from their past when they've seen people in authority. And that once they do that, you can interpret that this isn't me, this is you projecting this onto me. What Sullivan said is that you need to blunt that. You need to do things that violate their expectations about how you would act in this position. So you begin to understand how their mother or their father acted, and you do things that would be completely opposite of what they might do in a situation. Or they might you believe that as a therapist you should behave in a certain way, and you just refuse to behave that way.
Yeah, it's almost like a coyote leadership or a trickster leadership style, where you're identifying what the person's looking for and then giving them the opposite to mess with their preconceived notions.
You can be transparent about it. You don't have to be manipulative about it. You can say, I'm just not going to be who you want me to be. So you can try as hard as you want for me to be the boss. And yes, I have things that I can share with you, but I think you have to stop looking. And I think often at the Men's Wearhouse, people used to say to me these things that you wouldn't normally say to the president of the company because they knew that was okay.
Yeah.
It's almost like you want to build a profile of a senior executive and then you want to get people to systematically smash it.
Yeah. I mean, this goes back to what, the self-awareness that I mentioned earlier, where it's like, it's clear, you're clear about where your ego is. You're clear about like the ways in which you need to grow and the things that you're good at. You can make that clear to other people. And so they don't have to be on eggshells around you. And they know like the things they can confront you about, the things they can be candid about, and that you're not going to have a bruised ego when they tell you something like that.
I think I've done that with my children. I think the reason that, at least I believe I have a really good relationship with my children, is that I haven't acted like a dad a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. A dad or a mom is like an executive in a way. Mm-hmm. And I think that I've not allowed myself to just completely fall into that role. I mean, you'd have to ask Noah, but I think I do a really good job for the most part of violating the expectations people would have of what the dad is supposed to do.
Yeah, violating the expectations and not, rather than trying to live up to them and be like, oh, I'm supposed to know everything. Yes, I do know everything. Or it's really just, it's kind of deep honesty about where you're at.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I remember my kids would never bring their shoes up to their rooms. And I always used to bring their shoes up to their room so that they would be in their room. This was before people took their shoes off and everybody had their shoes lined up at the front door. But in those days, we wanted people to have their shoes in their room. But rather than tell my children, this is both literal and metaphorical, rather than tell my children, bring your shoes up to their room, I would just do it. And Diana always used to say to me, what are you doing? They're never going to learn if you don't insist that they bring their shoes up to their room. Little did she know that would be passé 20 years later. But I said, oh no, I'm just modeling for them the behavior, and eventually they'll just pick up on it. Of course, it didn't work. They never did. But I wasn't like a dad, is what I'm saying. I was like I don't know what.
I feel like this takes us pretty well to getting to a little bit about the life you can save. So give us the background of it, and then I'll ask you some pointed questions.
As I hope it's come across already, I've always been concerned about poverty, particularly the effect of American foreign policy on perpetuating poverty in the developing world, and then destroying progressive governments because they wouldn't play ball with the United States companies. I've always been concerned about that. But I never, as I said, or as Noah said, I quit doing anything about it when I was 30. And I had this very self-indulgent life where it was just built around my nuclear family and my own sort of desires, if you will. And in 2008, when I was president of the Men's Wearhouse, I was 59, and I said to myself, I better do something that is going to be consistent with my values, or I never will have, other than raise great kids and have a good relationship with my wife, and a few years as an activist in university and shortly after. So I decided not to become the next CEO of the Men's Wearhouse and to step down as president and look for something I could do that would be consistent with my own values. And it was reasonable for me to think that I didn't want to engage in macro political social change because I saw it as not really on the agenda right now. I didn't think we were on the threshold of creating worldwide democratic socialist governments. We had China, we had Russia, we had the United States. Now you can add India and Brazil. All the big countries in the world, most powerful countries in the world, are headed in the other direction. So I wanted to make an impact, but I didn't know how. And then I read Peter Singer's book, The Life You Can Save. And I said, okay, this is it. We might not be able to restructure the whole world, but we can save lives and reduce suffering if we are able to teach people that they ought to do that and that there are ways to do it that are relatively simple. And so I wrote Peter Singer an email. I'd never met Peter. I didn't even know who Peter was before I read Practical Ethics in the Life You Can Save. And I said that Diana and I would be interested in helping develop his organization. And one thing led to another. And we realized that we had this money that we should put into doing something really valuable. And so we put up a lot of money to create the organization. And I volunteered as executive director. And so for the past 8 years, we have been trying to do two things. One, spread the message that all lives being equal, the best and most cost-effective way to put your charitable donations is in the developing world, where only 6% of American donations go. And that there are highly effective nonprofits that you can donate to where the money will actually get to doing what you want it to do. It won't fall in the hands of a corrupt bureaucrat or dictator or business person or whatever. And that we recommend these organizations, which we curate from other researchers primarily, and that's in the process of changing. But anyway, I decided that this would be a great thing to do, and that's how I got to doing this work. And it's been just an amazingly wonderful chapter of my life that's more consistent with the values I was trying to live by between 1968 and 1975, and also the values I think I tried to raise my children with, and that to some extent I tried to implement at the Men's Wearhouse, at least in terms of this non-hierarchical leadership, or what's sometimes referred to as servant leadership, which was one thing we talked about a lot at the Men's Wearhouse, was the concept of servant leadership, leading by example, not asking people to do things you wouldn't be willing to do, etc. So that's what I've been doing for the last 9 years, and been really lucky to do it with some success.
And what is the best way of getting people, I guess the targets are probably people in the first world, but getting people to give more of their income or their excess income to these organizations that are going to create like the highest amounts of happiness or changes in suffering of people?
I don't know what the best way to do it is, but we've tried a lot of different things, including distributing Peter's book, which we bought from Random House. And so we turned it into an audio book that we were fortunate enough to get a bunch of celebrities to read, which attracts people. And we turned it into an ebook so people could read it on their Kindles. And we offer that for free on our website. So one way we do it is by marketing these ideas. We've created other short form videos which get across the same idea. And Peter has a famous thought experiment that he's used and that we use in trying to get across the ideas. Basically, the thought experiment is we ask people to imagine that they're walking by a pond and they see a little girl drowning and nobody's there to help her. and they think, oh my gosh, should I go in and save her? But if I do, two bad things are going to happen. I'm going to ruin my $350 of clothing, and I'm going to be late for work. So should I jump in? And of course, everybody says, I should jump in. And then we point out to them that, well, there's 5.3 million children dying under 5 of largely preventable diseases every single year, and that there are really effective ways of keeping that from happening. So if you want to feel like you're doing something, here's something you can do. You can donate to those charities that are doing something about it. So we do it by thought experiments. We do it by providing information. And what we're hoping to do is get to people's emotions and their intellect at the same time. So you first have to have the instinct to give and want to help, and that may be an emotional thing. And then you have to know how to do it, which may be a more intellectual thing. So Mandela said that combining the head and the heart is a formidable combination. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is get people to use both their hearts to motivate them and their heads to figure out what to do. And so we're supplying information. The biggest problem we have is distributing the message as widely as we would like to, because that requires money and cleverness and rich people that want to support your efforts to do it. But we have managed to raise about $45 million over the last 8 or 9 years for these really great nonprofits. So we're continuing to try to do that, but we want to scale. And that requires doing it in more creative ways and doing more of it.
And what's the role of guilt?
I don't talk too much about ethical responsibility to do this. I talk more about the opportunity to do some really good things, which is how I experience it. I think some people give out of guilt, but I think and Peter certainly makes people feel guilty when they read their book and then his book and don't do much about it. But guilt just, in my mind, sends people into denial or escape. And I think what we want to get people to realize, as I said, I made this video that you don't have to be brave to save lives, which is on our homepage. And the idea there is you have the opportunity to save more lives than Batman, or more lives than Superman, or more lives than Superwoman. And you don't have to leave your own living room to do it. Just look at some information and write a check, basically. And I know that sounds very glib, but it's true. And so I think that giving people the sense of their amazing opportunity to do something they probably never thought they could do. I don't know about you, Ankur, but whether you've ever actually physically saved anybody's life. Like, you probably haven't been in any wars. I haven't been in any wars. But I did once save somebody's life. She was walking in front of a streetcar in San Francisco, and I literally pulled her before the streetcar ran her over. And that was a really scary but gratifying experience. It's probable that at The Life You Can Save, we've saved tons of lives over the last 9 years, but it's very abstract. You can't really feel it the same way. So one of the things we need to do is to use technology like the kind that you might be able to create to try to get people to really figure out how the experience of pulling somebody in front of a streetcar or jumping in the pond and saving that girl. I mean, I don't know anybody that wouldn't jump in the pond and lose $350 and their suit of clothes. But very few people as a percentage are doing anything about the other 5.3 million children.
And the idea, some of the arguments in Peter's book, the explanation for that is it has to do with this abstraction. That, like, when we can see the face of the little girl a few yards from us, it's just so clear. But we don't have the face or the name, but there's just so many and they're so far and so abstract that it's not alive to us in the same way.
We're not doing a very good job of making it alive. If we can get more money to distribute creatively the ideas and make them live for people more, I think we'll do much better.
Okay, but let's say you had all the, somebody comes to you, I don't know, some kind of like billionaire type creature comes to you and says, hey, here's $100 million to make this really alive for people. What would you do? Like, what would it take?
Know. I'd hire you. No, but seriously, I don't really know, but I know we can do better. And I know that, like, even at our level, for every dollar we've spent on our operation and trying to get the message out, we've probably raised $17 over the last 3 years for these charities. So even we're doing it now. And I think there are a lot of people more clever than us who could do even a better job, but it's not that easy. I mean, there are people that have been researching how to flip the philanthropy switch in the right way for a long time, and there's no single answer. We've learned some things, but it's not an easy problem to solve.
Mm-hmm.
But I know we can solve it, and I know that if you give us $100 million or $10 million, we won't waste your money. Based upon our previous track record, if you give us $10 million, we'll probably raise $170 million for these charities. So not a bad return. And I think we can do better and better. So that's how I try to sell people contributing to the effort. But sometimes I meet people who are wealthy, like I did the other day. And what I try to sell them on is the idea of joining the Life You Can Save and helping us do a better job, because they're those kind of people. And even though they have a lot of money, I'd actually rather get their talent. And I have to say, they really appreciated that approach, because given that they're rich, people are always asking them for money.
Sure. Yeah.
But they said nobody else had ever approached them about using their skills, which is kind of interesting, since one of the guys was almost a founder of Airbnb, and the other woman was a project manager, a product salesperson that had done amazing jobs of bringing products to market and selling them. So it surprises me that people don't really try to go after their skills. So I don't know. I'm still in the process of talking to them. But what I would do at this stage of my life is find people like you or Jessica or Andrea and try to interest them in working with us, either in a paid position if they need money, or in an unpaid position if they don't.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about for you personally? I mean, you said you started this organization, or you helped Peter develop it with a lot of your own funding. How do you make the decision as to what you keep for your family and for yourself and what you just give away?
I think we keep too much for our family and have given our children too much. So I can't really justify our algorithm, if you will, for doing that.
Yeah, I'm more interested in your process and your inner dialogue around it, rather than you having the right result.
I mean, it's not a very satisfying answer, but it feels somewhat arbitrary. We've decided that we're going to give away a minimum of 25% of our assets, and that would leave 75% for ourselves and our family. But I think that's not the right proportion, and so we're still engaged in that discussion. I don't know how we came up with 25%. If Peter comes up with some suggested minimums for people, and so we sort of use those as a guide. Most wealthy people find them way too demanding. We actually think we need to go well beyond them. Peter himself does. Peter gives away around a third of his income every year, and has for a long time. And he gave us recently $500,000. He won a prize that was $1 million, and he gave $500,000 to the Life You Can Save, $350,000 to animal welfare nonprofits, and $150,000 we're having people vote on where they think he should give it. And so he gave away all $1 million. There are not a lot of people in Peter's position that would have done that. So he definitely walks the talk, and Diane and I are trying to walk the talk, maybe not as much as Peter, but way more than anybody we know in our community of friends or colleagues, which has been disappointing. I mean, we don't think of ourselves as that generous. So I would have thought more people would have gotten on the bandwagon in our circle of friends, some of whom are quite wealthy. But You're going to figure out how to do that, so I don't have to worry.
I would be honored to collaborate with you on that. One thing I've noticed is that kind of an uptick in awareness in the past few years are these other kind of long-term risks besides poverty, like existential threats to humanity. How does that play into what you're doing? Is that related at all?
Well, we've just added climate change, which is not some organizations trying to deal with climate change, anthropomorphic climate change. So that's one way we're dealing with it. I think we're going to create more causes that relate to other kinds of things other than public health or poverty. But I think our target will always be people living in the developing world. So climate change is going to have a disproportionate impact on those people. But things like artificial intelligence and asteroids and things like that, we're not going to, that would be breaking the brand, I think, from my point of view. And I think that we're not going to get into that. So we don't really deal with that type of existential risk. I am worried about nuclear weapons. I mean, it comes up again in this Ukraine crisis. And I do think that maybe we should be doing something in terms of offering people who want to be engaged in the fight against nuclear weapons or pro-disarmament some outlet. We just haven't gotten there yet.
Mm-hmm. And the idea with that is like from like a Peter Singer or utilitarian perspective, this is something that could have a maximally bad outcome. So it's worth investing in avoiding.
Even though we don't know how to do it we can't be as sure about its impact as we are with a bed net or video to get their moms to bring kids to the health center. We know that the bad outcome is so bad that we should take a risk and try to do something about it. That's sort of the utilitarian logic. And that's what people who are interested in existential risk do, is they use these math to show that this, even though there's a tiny risk of it happening, the number of billions of people that would be affected. I don't really buy into that, really. It just doesn't move me.
Yeah, it's just so interesting, like what moves an individual, because I have friends that are just obsessed with that, and they're not moved by, say, police brutality, and then of course the inverse, and the whole thing of what you're trying to work on is how do you get people to be moved when this girl is not drowning in the pond in front of them, and there's just all these different layers of abstraction of what can move us and what does not. I just find that so fascinating because I grew up, being educated, studying a lot of math and computer science and philosophy and whatnot, thinking that a lot of our decisions were connected to information and rationality and logic. And then as I become more of an adult and more like the public life, I just see how for myself and for so many other people, that's actually not, we want that to be true. But it really is just like there's things that move us and there's things that don't. And it's very hard to tie that into logic.
Right. Which is why we want people to combine them, which I know you do. We need people for our mission to use their head and their heart, probably in the other order. Their heart is what motivates them to get involved, and their head helps them figure out the decisions that they need to make.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ankur, for chatting with me.
You thought that Charlie was okay?
I was going to give you the board feedback until I created the logical framework for myself. Because really the Charlie thing is another super interesting question, which to me is like maybe for both of us, a big part of the dilemma of our adult lives is, can we reconcile markets and our personal convictions? Mm-hmm. And when you tell the story from that lens, then the narrativizing becomes more informed and more interesting. The first time I was like, I don't get, like, why the fuck is this interesting? And then he went to work for Wearhouse for Men or whatever. It's like, but then when you get it in the context of what we're talking about and in the umbrella of Peter Singer's philosophy, it's more motivated. And then I felt like I was like, oh God, it felt, I had this experience. I was listening to it and I felt like it was like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Like he was us that came back from the future. It was like, here's what happens. All right. You go in, you have all these convictions. You're totally green and you think you can change the world. I was in this political theater company when I was 19. I just totally immersed myself in this process, this theater work, these very inflammatory performance pieces. And then we'd have these dialogues in a room. We'd lock everybody in the theater and make them share what they felt from the thing. We'd facilitate these dialogues. And my dad came up to me after one of those, the first one that he came to see. It was called Uncle Tom Deconstructed. And it was sort of this exploration of all these tropes, these racist stereotypes and tropes that permeate kind of our society. And my dad comes up to me, he goes, Mijo, don't try to change the fucking world. And I was so pissed at him, I was like, fuck, what a lame thing.
But he spent his life as a activist, as an organizer, right?
He did a lot, yeah. But now this is him talking from the other side of having become a small business owner with a cleaning company and having like worked, you know, he worked a lot in the prisons doing like men's groups to men's programs. He showed the first pornographic film at San Quentin. He said it was so quiet in there you could hear a fucking pin drop. It was like the most epic thing. And he just sent the whole prison to show him this Deep Throat on a projector in the cafeteria. Was like this monumental act of activism. You know, and he worked with the Brown Berets. Then he started organizing for ex-cons, you know, after. So he was a social worker. He worked in migrant studies. He did like this. But at the end of the day, he had a family to support. And he had all of these existential concerns that were like immediate, and they were no longer, it was not like there was nothing abstract about the mortgage or the bills or putting food on the table.
Yeah. That's something Charlie, when I met him for the first time, he had a line like, for my entire life until I had a kid, I had the sense that the most important things that were going on were out there in the world. And I wanted to be engaged with them. And then I had this kid, and all of a sudden it flipped, and I felt like the most important, meaningful things were going around here, really close to me. And as a father, there's like, I feel that there's such a beauty to that. And as someone who wants to make the world a better place, I see just so much danger when we feel that way. Because that's what can lead to what we talked about earlier with, you know, then you're sitting on a beach in Hawaii with your kid while there's all this other stuff going on. And then there's this incredible cognitive dissonance and guilt and the illusion that somehow you're not connected to that.
I mean, I think the other thing, like the elephant in the room, maybe it's not an elephant in the room, but the incentives that are at play are, I think, often overlooked, or at least it's hard for us to appreciate it in the focus of the other, like looking at someone else's decisions that they're making. And just, you know, to put that full circle, is, you know, I came back decades later and really understood what my dad meant when I had some of those same incentives at work. Yeah. And you have to answer things that are not so global, but are immediate. And you can't really, it's almost like the ideologies of our youth feel like luxuries at that stage.
Are you saying that, you know, he's coming, like the Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, he's coming back from the future, but he's giving us this, like, he's telling us the journey you just said with you and your dad. But there's also some hope at the end that he found, like, another way of making that contribution.
That's what the episode said to me. So there was hope, and it wasn't like hope with a bow wrapped around it either.
Yeah.
He didn't have all the answers. No. He didn't know. He didn't know. It's not like, oh, I went through the Odyssey and the hero's journey, and then I got there at the end. It just, and it even was, it's in that sense, it's more inspiring because, you know, like we've talked about this book before, but the Paulo Freire and Miles Horton book, We Make the Road by Walking. You know, I always think of that phrase so we make the road by walking, and by doing, by, you know, the praxis of our ideas. How do we actually create relationships and markets that and actual interactions and economic interactions? What is the actual way, the Tao of this thing, not just something that we can espouse on our university campus or at an open mic, you know, or to our little confirmation bubbles and friends that are like-minded, but how do we actually put these theories and ideas into practice? And this is kind of what the hope that I got out of this conversation with Charlie, and also from Peter Singer's work in general. Yeah, beautiful. I'm happy to hear it, because there's many ways you could hear that story. But that's something I would want our listeners to come away with. You know, the sense of, you know, I think of our listeners as people who want to make a positive impact in the world and know that there's many ways that they can work on themselves. You know, this kind of sense of personal transformation that will facilitate that. And that's a takeaway I would hope people could get out of that episode, is that there's lots of options available. This is a kind of bizarre, unlikely story
of someone going this way and then that way and then this way again, but ending up at a place where you found a kind of an unexpected way to make a contribution.
Well, and so many of the narratives that you've brought forward on this show have been like that, this kind of meandering path, you know. And in Momentum Lab, we work with people through this module about purpose.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to me to do that work, because I think so often the assumption is that I need some reductive kind of formulaic thing. And to me, it's just impossible to engage with it that way. It has to be this interaction, it's alive, right? And it's responding to my imagination and my creativity as much as it is giving me feedback from my experiences and my relationships and the results I'm getting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, it'd be great to be Gauss, you know, the mathematician, or to be Mozart and have done these phenomenal feats at the age of 4 or 5, and then have a real clear inkling from early on what the purpose is. I'm not dissing that at all. I think that's awesome. But but there's other options for us.
Yeah.
We're not just like hopelessly adrift if we don't have those experiences.
All right. Well, I hope everyone got as much value out of this episode, this conversation, as I did. Thank you all so much for listening. Follow us on Twitter, 10KH Show is our handle. Leave a comment. Let us know what you think. And thank you all so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
That concludes another episode of 10,000 Heroes. Your hosts were Ankur Shah Delight and Nathan Ramos. Special thanks to Pierre for the awesome episode artwork, and to DJ Plainview for our theme music. If you like the show and you want to support our mission and our growth, here are 3 things you can do. 1, think of 3 people you know who would enjoy the episode you just listened to, and tell them about it. Call them on the phone, send them a text, send them a link, whatever. But share your enthusiasm. 2, leave a glowing review on your podcast platform if they support it. Having lots and lots of glowing reviews is a great way for us to get found by other listeners. And 3, get in touch. Email us at info@10kh.show. Follow us on Twitter at 10khshow. Connect us with people you know who would be great guests. Give us constructive feedback, or just like in point 1 above, share your enthusiasm. Thank you and take care.